This is going to be fun. We're in the first day of our series on doubt, and what I really appreciate about this is that if we're really honest, all of us have doubt if you really try to engage your heart and mind as it relates to Jesus, resurrection, and all of those things. And we've been accepting a lot of questions around this particular topic. Is Jesus dead? And so, like I said before, you'll want to get your phones out. We're going to be doing some live polling. You'll want to get the notes out because there's a lot of them. I don't know if you noticed, a ton of notes. So here we go.
Yeah.
Why are we even doing a series? I mean, we're talking about the resurrection, but just in general, why are we even doing a series on doubt, Rob?
Well, I know in my own journey, I've been plagued with doubt from the very beginning, actually, of my faith journey. I was 14 years old when I decided to kind of walk on my own 2 feet to follow Jesus. And it was shortly thereafter, I was in a honors English class because I'm kind of a nerd. And our teacher had us reading books that reflected different worldviews. Like we read Siddhartha, which immerses you into the Buddhist worldview. We read The Stranger, which is about nihilism and that worldview. And because I have a very kind of academic bent and a big imagination, I could really put myself into their shoes. And for the first time in my life, I began to think, you know what, if I was born in South Asia, I'd probably be a Buddhist. And I would be convinced of the superiority of that worldview. If I was born in Saudi Arabia, I'd probably be a Muslim. And I began to search for myself, like, are all worldviews equivalent? Like, why do I believe what I believe? And that is a journey that has continued my whole life. I feel like my faith is constantly in this reformation. And one of the primary drivers for that has been doubt. And in some streams of Christianity, doubt is perceived as an enemy, as something to be squelched, or weakness of character. But in my journey, doubt has been one of the single most powerful sources for what I consider a continually renewed, intellectually honest faith.
Then I don't think you're the only one who feels that way.
No.
Because I feel that way. And I think probably everyone that I talk to, they deal with a certain level of doubt.
It's true. In fact, if you're a note taker, you can write this down. I think that doubt is an inescapable part of the human condition, and that's why we need to talk about it. And sometimes believers think that skeptics or doubters, they think of them in a stereotypical way, like they're all given over to meaninglessness and moral confusion and despair.
Right. Yeah.
And then sometimes my friends who are skeptics, I kind of catch them looking at believers in a stereotypical way. Like we're all a bunch of non-thinking, we checked our brains at the door, like moralizing, judgmental people. And we all know when you get down to the grassroots level, it's a lot more complex than that. Like the faith, and doubt, belief and doubt, it's not two different camps of people. It's a line that runs down the middle of all of us. And we're just saying it's okay to have doubts. Can you just tell me, Rob, it's okay? See, it is. It's okay. And what I love about the scripture is that it's honest about these doubts that we have to deal with, right? And that leads to the second observation, which is this, write it down. When certainty is impossible, following Jesus is still on the table. So we all have doubts. That's a part of being a human. If you don't want to have doubts, find a different species to be a part of. Right?
Well, isn't it also true that part of the doubting is just a manifestation of our own finite intellect anyway?
It's true. Like we're trying, we just saying, Jesus, you are the beginning and the end. Jesus said, in the book of Revelation, I am the Alpha and the Omega. If we were to put it into more contemporary terms, it's like if you go down to the quantum level of creation, down to quarks and gluons, and then if you go all the way out to the known edges of the universe, Jesus is saying, I am bigger than that. So with my 3.5 pounds of brain, my finite mind, trying to comprehend the infinite, a posture of humility seems to be necessary. But that combination of faith and doubt doesn't make it impossible to follow Jesus. And here's what I mean by that. Think about it this way. In the New Testament, if I were to ask you what character is associated with doubt, who would you say?
Doubting Thomas.
Right, Doubting Thomas, which I think is totally unfair. Because after Jesus, was arrested, everybody bailed on Jesus. It wasn't just doubting Thomas, it was doubting Peter and doubting everybody else. And if you scale back even farther, from the very beginning of the story, Adam and Eve, did they doubt? right? I mean, jump forward to the icon, the patriarch of our faith, Abraham. Did he have issues with doubt? Like every single human being. That's one of the things that's so compelling to me about the Bible. It doesn't try to hide the doubts of the leaders. And if you were going to make up a story, you probably wouldn't just put in there like all the leaders are messed up and full of doubt and always making the wrong decisions. And so I think it's so compelling to me because basically what God is saying is, I'm an equal opportunity employer of doubters. Come to me as you are. He doesn't ask us to pretend, to manufacture certainty that we don't have. He accepts us where we are, and then he asks us to be faithful and step forward in our doubts and through our doubts. And one of the most powerful examples of that is in Matthew 28. Look at this moment. It says, then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. So Jesus is resurrected. He's conquered sin, death, hell, and the grave. And he's asking them to meet him on this mountain, and it is an apex moment. They are standing with the resurrected Savior. And look at what it says. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted.
That is so hilarious to me because I hear people say a lot, and even some of the questions that got submitted were things like, why doesn't God just reveal himself? And in this particular case, he did.
Yeah.
He revealed himself, the resurrected Jesus, but that didn't fix the problem, obviously.
Yeah, because again, we're finite creatures and we're dealing with infinite questions. And even in this moment, it's like the infinite, the supernatural has hit the natural. It's like, I can't even, they're standing there going, I don't even know if I can believe my own eyes. Like, I don't have a category for what I'm experiencing. But look at what Jesus says, all right? Then Jesus came to them and said, you doubters, go manufacture certainty before you do anything. No, what does he say? He just goes on. He says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore go, you doubters. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations. He's like, go tell the world this good news about me that you're actually doubting right now with your very own eyes. Like he's accepting them where they're at. He's saying, get up and go, you doubters. I'll go with you. You're going to share about me. As you share about me, you're going to find your doubts healed, but you'll have new doubts. And what does he say? I will be with you always to the very end of the age. And this summer, we're going to explore the important role of doubt in our development. And it's going to be more about humility than certainty. It's going to be more about learning how to think than just giving you all the answers. And we're inviting everyone to embrace that tension that doubt is a necessary companion. And we're going to explore our doubts with real intellectual rigor and at the same time an open heart to Jesus. Because if you wait for all doubt to be removed before you do anything, guess what? You'll never take a job. You'll never get married. You'll never have a friend, and you'll never
have kids. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. And
but it sounds like to me though that so doubt and faith can coexist, and it doesn't really matter. So is that what you're trying to say? It doesn't matter.
No, it does matter. Belief and doubt are inevitable, but they aren't equal. And if you want, you can write that down. See, belief and doubt share the same inevitability. But when it comes to following Jesus, yes, you're going to experience both, but they don't lay an equal claim on us. And we have to kind of get off the fence. We have to decide, am I leaning towards doubt or am I leaning towards faith? And Jesus stands as what I would call kind of the great speed bump in the middle of history. And he demands a response. He asks us this question, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? Not who did your parents say that I am? Or who did your pastor say that I am? Or not like, right. Who did your skeptic, atheistic professor say that I am? It's like, no, you need to figure this out. And the Christian faith, unlike other religions, is not meant to be a blind faith. It's meant to be a rational faith based on historical truths about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And those truths are testable. And we all live at the mercy of our ideas about the way things are. So if I have genuine questions about Jesus, I can't follow him if I'm not willing to look honestly at those questions. And some of the questions we're going to hit this summer. Today is the question, is Jesus dead? Next week, is God a genocidal maniac? The following week is, did God give my mom cancer? The week after that is God narrow-minded. And the last week is God sending good people to hell. So you can tell we're going to try to duck the hard questions. We're just going to skirt around it, Try to avoid
In fact,
difficulty.
Of all these questions, I'm kind of curious. Let's do our live poll now. Which of these questions, if you open up your app, that black button there, live poll, and then you can answer question number 1 and submit it. Which of these questions that we're going to be tackling over the next 5 weeks, which of these has your name on it, the one that you struggle with the most? You can only pick one, all right? So just pick one and say, okay, which one do I struggle with the most? And then hit submit. And we are going to have the results on screen right now. There we go.
So it looks like the 2 top questions are, did God give my mom cancer?
Yeah.
And is God
I hear those a lot.
sending good people to hell? I do too.
Yeah, I hear those a lot. Here's the weird thing though, Rob. I don't have a lot of people that come up to me and have questions about the resurrection. I mean, even if you look here on the graph, that's the least one. That's the one that the least amount of people struggle with. So why are you even doing this today?
Well, I guess we won't. Let's just stop since you all know everything already. Bunch of smarty pants. Here's why we have to do this one. It's because all the others are contingent to the answer to the first one. The resurrection is the key, foundational, primary claim that Christianity is founded on. You know, if you consider that it wasn't a big deal for a poor Jewish pseudo-revolutionary to be crucified 2,000 years ago. That was actually a pretty common event. There was one day, actually, historians tell us, where 1,000 pseudo-revolutionaries were crucified by Rome. But what's extraordinary is this claim, that after this pseudo-revolutionary was crucified and put in a grave, and his heart stopped beating, and his body grew cold in a tomb, lifeless for 72 hours, that his heart started beating again. Imagine that. That his eyes opened, that his head raised. He sat up, and he walked out of the tomb. That's a totally different type of claim. And there's really only 2 options. It's a forced choice. It's not like, did he kind of resurrect? Sort of. It's like, either he did or he didn't. And if it's true, it is the most important event in history, without a doubt. But if it's false, it's the most colossal waste of time. I just think about me dedicating my life. Like, I got up this morning, I spent time alone with Jesus, and I had a profound sense of his presence and him interacting with me. I've given my life to serve others, to help them connect. If it's false, you know what that means? I have a big imaginary friend that I like to share with all of you. You know, I mean,
I could have been at the lake today.
Exactly. You know? And at the beginning of the series, we have to start with the resurrection because everything depends on it. When you examine the first century documents that we call the New Testament, you'll discover the central claim of Christianity is that Jesus physically, literally, bodily rose from the dead. And without it, everything else falls apart. And in fact, Paul says it this way. This is considered by many scholars, Christian and non-Christian, one of the most unique passages in all religious literature because it makes this religion testable. And here's what Paul says. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is what? It's useless. Underline that and then put a little arrow to the next phrase. And so is your faith. He's basically like, if that didn't happen, I'm stupid. And guess what? You're even more stupid for listening to me. I mean, there's an honesty there. And what Paul admits is that Christianity is falsifiable. And its reliability depends on the resurrection. Paul's saying it actually matters if the resurrection happened or not. It's testable. No amount of blind faith is enough if you believe a lie. And he's saying if Christ isn't raised, our preaching, in other words, not just the things I'm teaching, but all the other gospel writers, like it's all hogwash. And Paul is very hardcore about this.
Well, I get that, but you can have a religion without a resurrection. I mean, every other religion doesn't have a resurrection, and that's just fine, right? So why do you need a resurrection?
Yeah, Paul doesn't leave that one on the table, and here's why. The reason he's so hardcore about throwing everything out if the resurrection is false, because foundations matter. You know, all the teachings in the New Testament are built on the foundation of the resurrection. The whole message of Christianity is built on the resurrection. A lot of people think the cross, you know, is the foundation for Christianity. It's not. I mean, if Jesus is dead, it's game over. It's built on the foundation of the resurrection. And I have friends who've said to me, like, I think the resurrection, it was probably a metaphor. It was probably like kind of like a spiritual event that happened. There was new life even though he died, And I believe in the core tenets of Christianity. And what I try to explain respectfully is I think that's kind of a superficial sort of reflection on the tenets of Christianity. Because
Or they say that they have a problem with miracles, and resurrection is a miracle. That just doesn't happen normally.
And that the rest of it's okay even if that didn't happen.
Right.
And here's why I think that's problematic. If the resurrection didn't happen, that means one of two things. The people who wrote the New Testament, who were followers of Jesus, who literally, many of them were martyred for this, it means one of two things about them. That after Jesus died, either they all got together and said, this message that Jesus taught was so important, we have to pass it down to future generations, and the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we place it on a big lie. That's one option. Or the other option was they were so gullible, they got somehow taken by a con man who somehow faked a death and resurrection that they fell for.
Right.
And so if the foundation is cracked, I don't think you can build any teaching on it. And that's, I think, what Paul was saying. If that foundation is broken, then, well, don't trust anything else that you hear.
Okay.
It's the equivalent of a friendly sayings in a Hallmark card. and that's not my teaching, that's Paul's teaching. And C.S. Lewis summarized it this way: Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it can't be is moderately important. And I guess what I'm saying is you need to take the time to explore the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, because everything is contingent upon that.
So,
like whether
let's
or not,
get a feel for that then.
Okay.
Before we even get started, I'm curious to know, let's go ahead and take the live poll survey and hit question number 2. Where do you land? And just be honest. I mean, it's anonymous, and nobody's going to chase you down or anything. Where do you land on this spectrum? It's like, is it yes, he really rose, or it's probably likely, or you're not exactly sure, or definitely he did not rise from the dead? I'm kind of curious as to what people's responses are on that one. We can show those on screen now.
refresh.
Yeah.
Let's see where we're at.
Well, here's where we are.
Okay.
Okay, here we are. Yeah, baby, really died, really rose. That's like by far where people are at. And then there's some that are saying it's probably more likely than not, but they're not 100% positive.
Right. And then we've got some folks at the other end too, not sure, but it's probably an exaggeration that grew over time. And the last one is not dead people stay dead. But what's interesting is in our gathering, we have the full spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. When we gather as the church, it's easy for pastors like me to assume like, oh, the resurrection, all good, everyone's on board. And a lot of people have heard teaching about the resurrection and the implications, but I think a lot of people have never actually heard like, well, why would I actually believe in the resurrection in the first place? Is there actually historical data that points that direction? So we're going to look at the historical data and the proof for the resurrection. And we've got to kind of lay a foundation, so we have to do a little work on how history works before we can actually dig into the data and the proof for the resurrection.
Yeah, because it was one of the questions that got submitted to you last week, and he said, the resurrection, it happened, occurred 2,000 years ago. Can we really know anything about the ancient past?
Okay, and here's my response to that. You can write this down. We can know the truth, not only about the resurrection, but other things in ancient history, okay, if we use the right tool and the right sources. So it's an intelligent question to say, hey, what's actually feasible for us to know about from the past? So you have to use the right tool, and the right tool is history. So we're looking for historical evidence, not mathematical or scientific evidence. We have to think like Sherlock Holmes with a magnifying glass. We're not scientists in lab coats. So we have to think about it like we're a lawyer gathering the preponderance of evidence, and it's about not certainty, but probabilities. And one New Testament historical scholar, Ben Witherington, he describes it this way: the most the historian can establish about events in the past is a good probability, one way or another. So that's where we're setting the bar. That this is, or that event did or did not happen. There's no such thing as absolute certainty on these matters. So we don't learn about Nero or Aristotle or Alexander the Great by solving a math problem, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, you can't scientifically prove the existence of George Washington.
Exactly. And the reason
historically you can.
Yeah. But it's a different type of argument. And it's important to understand that because we live in a culture where science is king. And one assumption I run into nowadays is it's like people don't believe you can actually know anything unless science can prove it. Now, I am pro-science. I really am a geek. Like, I listen to science podcasts on my own, and no one even has to make me do it. I'm that weird. Like, I actually read science books. I know, it's strange. I come in, I talk to J-Mo about it. Let's talk about quantum physics.
He's got some weird theories.
Thanks. So I am pro-science, but science is only one slice of the knowledge pie. I mean, you can know things through literature and law and politics and philosophy and history. History is a valid way to gather evidence, and all history relies on testimony. So the right tool is history, and here's the right sources, okay? You need to find the earliest eyewitness sources you can. All right, that's one thing. And then also, how many of those sources do you have? So that's what historians work with. They're looking for reliable testimony, and then how much testimony do you have? And so that's what we're going to look at in behalf of Jesus. We're going to look at what are the number of sources, and are they early eyewitness sources, and see how that adds up. And so if historians, let's say, want to know about the Persian Wars, they go to Herodotus. Right? If they want to know about Alexander the Great, they go to Plutarch. If they want to know about first century Jewish history, they go to Josephus. Historians, if they want to know about Jesus of Nazareth, this is Christian and non-Christian alike. They rely on the first century biographers of Jesus, which were Matthew and Luke and Mark,
wait a minute,
John,
wait a minute,
and Paul.
I hear this all the time, and they say, wait, that's circular reasoning. You're saying that the Bible proves the Bible.
That's right. Let's just go on. No, actually, we're not using the Bible to prove the Bible. The problem is these letters that were written in the first century in Greek, telling this remarkable story about Jesus, right? Now, later on, centuries later, they were collected under one cover, and they were called the New Testament. But that wasn't until hundreds of years after Jesus. Like, what we're looking at now is these letters. By historical standards, these are the earliest and most primary sources about the life of Jesus. So we're not appealing to them as being inspired right now. We're appealing to them as reliable historical documents that are primary sources. So that's an important distinction.
Right. So why don't we go ahead and take another live poll real quick? Because I've heard a lot of times that ancient history can't be reliable because it's just a game of ancient telephone. You're getting secondhand information from other people that's passed down from generation to generation to generation. So go ahead and go into your mobile app and just swipe to question number 3. How reliable is ancient history? And we have got 3 options there: not reliable, oral traditions, a game of telephone; somewhat reliable, it's got to be better than the fake news on Facebook; or very reliable, we've got a decent picture, standard def. What do you think? Hit one of those and hit submit. And we will show the results on screen. Here we go.
Yes, so most of us are landing in the middle, somewhat reliable or very reliable, but almost 10% are asking the question.
So it almost looks as if, the second one is, it's basically admitting that just like Facebook, where you get all kinds of craziness, that probably happened in the ancient world too.
Yeah, and I think we need to take a minute before we look at the data for the resurrection to stop and talk about how ancient history works, so we know the foundation we're standing on. Ancients weren't stupid. Sometimes as moderns, we kind of look back and think all those ancient people are a bunch of idiots.
Yeah, they're primitive.
We're finally smart now, but actually, if you're talking about like primordial history, yeah, that's all legends. But by the time you get to the first century, all the values of modern history are actually in place. So ancient historians differ from contemporary historians in some of the tools that they used. Like, for example, they would use a tool called spotlighting. I'm talking about ancient historians, where the central character in the historical event, they would sometimes write it like they were the only person at the event, like no one else was there. Right. Like a modern historian would look at that and go, well, that's not accurately representing it, But underneath it, ancient historians, they weren't just spinning fables, they were still concerned with what historians called facticity. They were trying to communicate the facts. Yes, they have their limitations. Yes, they have their biases. But the values of modern history were already in place in the first century. And I just want to give you one example. This is from the first century. This is from a secular historian, a Roman historian named Pliny the Elder. He's describing his methodology as an historian. And look at what he says. He says, I surveyed about 2,000 volumes. We have collected 36 volumes of 20,000 noteworthy facts obtained from 100 different authors that we have explored. For you must know that when collating authors, I have found that most professed reliably, and modern writers have copied the old authors word for word without acknowledgement. Now, this was in the first century. And what Pliny is saying is, I brought all the best sources together, I compared them, we attempted to pass them down, we verified what we could, and what we could verify, we made no adaptation, we passed them down. Does that sound like a good historian, yes or no? Right? And then you look at the historian Luke, who was a first century biographer of Jesus, look at the same values of a historian that he articulates in chapter 1 of his gospel. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were the first, who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. You could lay that right on top of Pliny, and you can see a historian's commitment. All right, and here's one scholar from Notre Dame, my old stomping ground, Dr. David Anu. He says this, the very fact that he's talking about the gospel writers, they chose the Greco-Roman biographical conventions. In other words, there's a genre, it's called Greco-Roman biography. That was the genre that all the gospel writers wrote in. And they told the story of Jesus in that format because it indicates they were essentially concerned to communicate what really happened. So what I want to do is I want to look at what do the sources actually say about Jesus? Not just the Christian sources, but what we might call the secular sources. And if you jump forward to the next part of your notes, you'll see a bottom line on historical resources. So we're looking for early eyewitness testimony, and then we're also looking for the number of sources, okay? So you need to know in the ancient world, I mean, a lot of historical events might have 1, 2, or 3 sources. Okay, now let's compare that to Jesus. Regarding Jesus, there are 18 independent primary sources for the existence of Jesus, 12 Greco-Roman and Jewish sources, 6 Christian sources. These include Jewish historian Josephus, Roman historians Tacitus and Pliny, the Christian sources of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul. That's not an exhaustive list, but we have 18 independent sources.
And twice as, if I'm looking at these numbers right, twice as many regarding Jesus aren't even, they're secular.
That's right.
So and they're not biased.
So let's just play like devil's advocate. Let's take the Christian sources off the table. So what do just the secular sources tell us about the life of Jesus? Here's the bottom line. Jesus was a third of the first century Jew who lived in Israel, was born out of wedlock, whose ministry intersected with that of John the Baptist, who became a popular teacher and wonder worker, who gathered particularly close disciples to himself, 5 of whom are named, although some of the names are garbled, it's still clear who they were, who consistently taught perspectives on the law that ran afoul of the religious authorities' interpretations, who was believed to be the Messiah, who was eventually crucified under Pontius Pilate, who was a Roman procurator. I have the hardest time with that word today.
Procurator.
Is that right?
Yeah.
All right, someone, you can correct us afterwards. In Judea, which enables us to narrow the date for that event to somewhere between AD 26 and 36.
He was a professional curator.
That's right, he was a pro.
Procurator, yeah.
And was allegedly seen by many of his followers as bodily resurrected from the dead. Instead of dying out, the movement of his followers continued to grow with each passing decade, and within a short period of time, we're singing hymns to him as if he were God. So these aren't even the best biographical resources, but we still have all the historical facts of Jesus. What you have from the secular sources is the same story that we heard in the Gospels.
Well, there is one, I mean, this proves a lot about the facts of Jesus and that his followers claim that he rose from the dead.
Yep.
But it doesn't necessarily say that, in the secular sources at least,
you're right,
that a resurrection actually occurred.
Yeah, what we're dealing with here is you'll sometimes hear people say Jesus is a myth, you know? No, all the historical data, by all normal historical standards, bedrock. The shape of Jesus' life that was given to us in the Gospels, it's the story that really happened. It's reliable. If you throw the story of Jesus out, it's historically unreliable. You have to throw all of ancient history out, because there's more data for this just on normal, standard historical approaches than pretty much any other ancient life or event. And it's remarkable when you consider that Jesus was a poor peasant, that there's this many sources. Like you can read about Roman governors and Roman generals, and there'll be 1 or 2 sources about them. There's 18 about Jesus. So obviously, this poor Jewish carpenter was so extraordinary that the world was paying attention, something profound. So with that said, what I want to look at now is we have historical data about Jesus. How does that historical data point to the proof or greater probability of his resurrection than not? So that leads us to this third observation. Okay, 7 minimal facts that point to the great probability of the resurrection. There's 7 reasons when you put these together, they point to the probability of the resurrection. It's called the minimal facts theory, and it was developed by Gary Habermas. And the minimal facts are backed by so much evidence that nearly every scholar who studies the subject, even the rather skeptical ones, accept them. In other words,
what lowest common denominator.
Exactly.
You might believe a lot of things, but this at least you have to accept.
Yeah, like skeptics and believers both agree with these when it comes to historians. So what Habermas did is he studied and poured over 3,400 scholarly publications and began to categorize what are the minimal facts that the vast majority of scholars accept. And you take those minimal facts that even your opponents will allow you, and you build your case from there. So these are 7 facts that the majority of professional Jesus historical studies scholars accept, both conservative and skeptic. They affirm these minimal facts. So we're going to quote Scripture, but again, we're not appealing to Scripture as being divinely inspired. We're just referring to them as the early and primary sources by normal historical standards.
Okay.
Clear?
All right.
All right, so let's hit them. Fact number 1 is this: the public execution of Jesus of Nazareth in Jerusalem by Roman crucifixion. It's solid as stone. The Romans did public executions. So there were government officials, soldiers, Jewish leaders, general public. They made a spectacle of them. And when you look at Jesus, the description of his crucifixion, historical studies confirm that all those details, like everything from the scourging, carrying the cross, nails being driven into hands and feet, being hung and exposed naked, the piercing of the side with a lance, these were all common practices, and
and if you stop and think about it too, Roman executioners, that's their job to kill people. They were probably good at it.
Yeah, to say the least. In fact, one of the theories that got traction for a while is called the swoon theory. And it's this idea that Jesus was on the cross and then he was taken down. He wasn't actually dead. And it's interesting. In 1986, there were 3 leading pathologists that did immersive study on crucifixion, in particular the crucifixion of Jesus. And you won't believe what they came up with. He died. And in fact, in all of history, there's only 2 recorded accounts of people surviving a crucifixion. It was like Josephus interceded for 2 friends and a Roman governor. He somehow convinced them to take them down. They both died. So it's a historical fact.
Yeah,
Jesus
most people
died.
didn't even make it to the cross. The scourging did it.
Exactly. So enough said on that. Fact number 2, he was dead. But fact number 2 is this: there was this persistent belief among the disciples that they encountered the risen Jesus. Now, virtually no New Testament scholar would deny that the disciples believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. Not metaphorically, not a spiritual vision, but like bodily and physically. They were claiming that publicly. And we have 4 very early sources. We know they weren't copying each other because the accounts are kind of varied and different, even describing the same situations. They aren't all completely harmonious, which actually works in their favor, that it's eyewitness testimony. And then you get to the Apostle Paul, and he begins to list all of these people by name. And again, this is within living memory. So these are people that you could actually go to and ask. And he describes this in 1 Corinthians 15, it says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also, and I love this phrase, as the one who's abnormally born. He's like, I'm a weirdo, and Jesus appeared to me, right? So he's inviting his contemporaries. This was written within a very short time after the resurrection. He's inviting his contemporaries. He's saying, you don't have to believe me. Ask any of these people for yourself. And again, this is as good as history ever gets. And either they were hallucinating, they were like delusional.
All of them.
All of them. So
Right.
like this group of 600 delusional, poor, uneducated Jews, do you think a delusion would really have the staying power and the gravitas to create a worldwide movement that was the source of the most brilliant parts of Western civilization? That takes a lot of faith to believe that. The other thing is that they were all lying, that it was intentionally false, that they made up a religion. And now, again, think about made up religions. Like in our day, Scientology right now is under a lot of fire. Right? Ron L. Hubbard made up a religion, right? And he benefited from it. I mean, he was a millionaire. He had planes. He had a fleet of boats, right? Yeah. But look at Scientology. About 30 years in, what's happening to it? It's crumbling. Do you think there's any chance that Scientology 2,000 years from now is going to have 1 billion followers, right? So you look at this original group, and if they were lying, first of all, none of them got rich like Ron L. Hubbard. They were beaten. They suffered. Most of them were martyrs. And guess what? Martyrs don't make good liars.
Yeah, that
Right?
was actually one of the questions that Gerard submitted, was that if these people died for something like the resurrection, doesn't that tell you something?
Yeah. And you look at think of their transformation. Like Peter, for example, he denies Christ 3 times before the crucifixion. The pressure hits and he folds like a lawn chair, right? He's a coward. Post-resurrection, a few weeks later, after he claims to see the risen Christ, this guy's a lion. Like he's preaching that Jesus physically, bodily rose, that he is the Savior, the Lord of all. And the Jewish leaders, they beat him. And then they tell him, if you do this again, we're going to kill you. And he's like, bring it on. Who am I going to fear, God or men? Like Jesus is alive. And you look at these early followers of Jesus, and they lived poor and they suffered. There's no record of any of them recanting. And if they would have, their opponents would have made so much of it. But they were so transformed because they believed their answer straightforward. Jesus is alive. So let's get to the next fact. One of those people is the conversion of the persecutor Paul. Paul is one of them. Critical scholars love Paul and respect him. His brilliant mind, and he had this high social status prior to his conversion that's conceded by all historians. Paul's fervency, his devotion to Judaism was so great, he waged an all-out war against Christians. I mean, he was a terrorist, basically. Mm-hmm. And yet, the chief prosecutor becomes the chief proclaimer. Eventually, he's beaten and beheaded for his faith, and historians agree, Paul suddenly, and seemingly without explanation, became an entirely different man. And Paul's answer for that is, I saw the resurrected Christ. And then you go on to fact number 3, the conversion of James. And it's the same situation. You have multiple historians, Josephus, Hagesippus, Clement of Alexandria, who all report that James, the brother of Jesus, was martyred because he would not deny the resurrection of his brother. Which again, you look at the gospel accounts, and in the gospel accounts, James, he's ticked off at Jesus. He's like, my brother is a nut job. He's crazy. And in fact, at the crucifixion, he's not even there. I think he's just kind of like, my brother's a nut job. He got what he deserved. Man, I'm glad it's over because our family's been so embarrassed. And yet, later on, after the resurrection, he becomes the primary leader in the Jerusalem church to the point where he becomes a martyr. And let me ask you about your sibling. What would it take for you to believe your sibling was God? And that you would die for them on that belief? Any takers? What would they have to do? They'd have to rise from the dead to prove that to you.
Right.
And that's what happened. Number 5, the empty tomb of Jesus. The location of Jesus' tomb was well known by all. You read the historical narratives, they lack the characteristic of like late legendary narratives, and they embody the characteristics, again, common to early eyewitness accounts. For example, Mark mentions the name of the well-known Sanhedrin council member, Joseph of Arimathea, who gave the tomb to Jesus. Now, if you're going to fabricate an account, you don't put this kind of data point in there that allows you to go and actually interview prominent
you can
people.
Verify it and say that it was a lie.
Exactly. And it was accepted that if Jesus' body were in the tomb, it was game over. All you had to do is go and check. But again, all agree the tomb was empty. How do you explain the agreement about this empty tomb? That leads us to fact 6. Okay, it's this: the worship of Jesus as God in short order after his crucifixion. Now we have to do just a little bit of time machine work. How do you explain that monotheistic Jews that were raised in Judaism, and a fundamental tenet of their belief is that God is in heaven, he is transcendent, and humans are down here, the two are never the same. Like Rome and a lot of other pagan religions had demigod people. The Jews did not have a demigod, like half God, half man thing. That God was creator, sustainer, totally transcendent. Yet this man, Jesus, made such an impression on these devout Jews that by the end of his ministry, they literally see him as God in the flesh. They literally see him as Yahweh inside of a human being. That would have been anathema to Jews. There was no category for that. How do you explain that these Jews, despite everything that they were taught, besides the way they were raised, their culture, they're worshiping and praying to this human being as God? And devotion to Jesus as God, it didn't develop like hundreds of years later. Like if you do the historical work, it emerged quickly and suddenly. In the origins of Christianity, they were worshiping Jesus as God. What did Jesus do to make that kind of impression, right? And that leads to fact number 7, the explosion of the church as a transformational global movement. In 20 BC, there's no such thing as Christianity. But by the time you get to 120 BC, governors all over the Roman Empire are writing letters to the empire saying, what are we going to do about these Christians? There's literally millions of them. They are reproducing like rabbits. They're turning the Roman Empire upside down. And the first thing that you're going to notice about these Christians was the force of transformation they were wherever they settled. Like Romans were discarding unwanted babies like garbage. The radical love these Christians had, they would go and pick up these babies and they would adopt them and bring them into their home. For example, when the plague hit in Rome, everyone else is leaving the cities. The Christians had such a powerful confidence in the presence and the power of God and life beyond the grave that they stayed in the cities. They cared for the sick. The Christians were the first to elevate women beyond property to a place of equal status and leadership in the church. These are cultural breakouts. And how did this mostly poor, uneducated movement completely transform culture? These are the first people that started schools and orphanages and hospitals. Wherever they went, they brought this radical transformation. And if you ask the Christians why, they would say this: Jesus is alive. That's why. And look at what this historian says. It is virtually impossible for the historian to explain the origin of Christianity without the resurrection. Everybody knows that Christianity sprang into being midway through the 1st century AD, but that raises an obvious question. Why did it come into existence? What caused this movement to begin? Even skeptical New Testament scholars recognize that the Christian faith owes its origins to the earliest disciples' belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead. In fact, they pinned nearly everything on it. And see, how do you explain these 7 minimal facts? I look at the data, and I think the probability is clear. It's because Jesus rose from the dead. And if that's true, the repercussions of that are profound. If the resurrection is true, it changes everything. Amen, brother.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah. Because if it's true, here's what it
change
means. It means death doesn't win, life wins. If it's true, it means love wins, not hate. If it's true, it means hope wins, not hopelessness. If it's true, it means the God who created everything is now available to you as your teacher and your leader. If it's true, it means your problem with brokenness and sin and death is not final, that there is an answer in Jesus. And if it's true, you know what it means this morning? I really was sitting with the resurrected Savior. And that he's here right now for you. Now, I know we've only been able to skirt the surface, and some of you have questions, and we want to actually work on those questions.
Yeah, in fact, you can submit those questions in the mobile app if you have some more concerning the resurrection, and we will address those at noon Central Time on Wednesday on our Facebook page.
So please send them in.
Yeah, send them in. And we would love for you to send in questions on the topic that we're going to be hitting next Sunday. And the question is God a genocidal maniac? How do you reconcile the violence in the Old Testament with the New Testament Jesus? Because it seems like, it's almost a different person. And if perchance you would love to talk with someone about the things that you've heard this morning, we're going to have prayer partners down front for you to talk with them about it. But we will see you guys next week. Thanks for joining us.
Go in grace and peace.